Well, hello, good evening. Welcome to the virtual Norwich Bookstore reading space. And wherever you're joining us from tonight, I am very glad to have you here. On behalf of all of us at the Norwich Bookstore, welcome. My name is Sam. I'm one of the co-owners of the Norwich Bookstore here in Norwich, Vermont. And I'm very happy to be celebrating this new book, Unstitched, from our friends at Steerforth Press tonight. We have Brett Ann Stanciu here and Kerrin McCadden to talk about the book. Before we get started, I have just a couple of announcements to make. First of all, of course, we are celebrating the release of a new book tonight, which means that we do have books for sale. So many of you have already picked up your copies of Unstitched from the Norwich Bookstore. You've ordered them online or come into the store to pick them up. If you would still like to order a book, or if you need another one even, I will be posting links in the chat throughout the talk tonight, and we encourage you to purchase a copy or purchase another copy of Unstitched. We'll also be putting links to other books by these authors, other books that they mention. And we are delighted to be a bookstore that can fulfill your needs all over the country, whether you are near or far. We're happy to ship books all around the country via USPS Media Mail or other options of your choice. That's all on our website, norwichbookstore.com. And of course, if you're here in the Upper Valley area, we encourage you to come and visit us. We are open for browsing. You can also call us for contactless porch pickup. And either way, we would be delighted to get a copy of Unstitched, this wonderful and important book, to you. So again, I'm going to pop links in the chat throughout the talk tonight. Don't be shy. We hope you will pick up a copy of this book. Now, tonight's talk will run probably about 45 minutes, and afterwards we will open it up to questions. If you've got a question, we would love to hear from you. You can drop your questions into the Q&A module, which is at the bottom of your screen. You'll just find it right down there under Q&A. You can also type questions in the chat, and we will get to as many questions as we can at the end of the event. And thank you so much for participating in the discussion. And again, we would be delighted to see you if you are in our area. We are located on Main Street here in Norwich, Vermont. And if you're here, we are here 9 to 5, Monday through Saturday, and we'd love to see you come in. If you're tuning in from far away, and one of the great things about these virtual events is that you can tune in from all over the place. Again, you can support us online, and that's norwichbookstore.com. You can also follow us on social media. And about that, we do have many other events coming up. We maintain a full event schedule for most of the year. That event schedule is primarily virtual right now, but you can find out what else we've got going on by either following us on social media. We're at Norwich Bookstore on most of the major channels. You can also go on our website and sign up for our email newsletter. We send out one newsletter a week, which will have upcoming releases and staff picks, and it will also have the upcoming events that we have. And most of our events are free. They're free to attend and easy to attend, and there's sure to be something else that you will enjoy. So definitely encourage you to check that out and see what else we have coming up. Now, without further ado, I am delighted to welcome two great Vermont authors tonight to talk about a book very close to our hearts and very close to home. Unstitched is just out from our friends at Steerforth Press in Hanover, New Hampshire, just across the river from our store. And we are very happy to have this book out in the world and very happy to be supporting it and excited to be hearing more about it. Unstitched is by Brett Ann Stanciu. Brett Ann Stanciu is a librarian. She is a graduate of Marlboro College and a recipient of the Vermont Arts Council Creation Grant. Her 2015 novel, Hidden View, portrays the challenges of a hardscrabble family farm. She lives in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont with her family, from where she joins us tonight. And joining Brett Ann Stanciu is Kerrin McCadden. She is the author of American Wake, currently a finalist for the New England Book Award, Landscape with Plywood Silhouettes, which is winner of the New Issues Poetry Prize and the Vermont Book Award, and the chapbook Keep This to Yourself, winner of the Button Poetry Prize. She's a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship recipient, and she teaches at the Center for Technology Assets and lives in South Burlington, Vermont. Please, from wherever you're joining us tonight, join me in giving a warm Upper Valley welcome to Kerrin McCadden and Brett Ann Stanciu. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you so much
What
for
a
that.
wonderful introduction. Thank you. And there goes Sam. Hi, Brett. How are you?
Good. It is a pleasure to be here tonight with you, Kerrin.
It's a pleasure to be with you too, and to talk about your exciting new book. It's such an exciting time. It's a hard time to bring books out, but it's also a really exciting time because people need books and they need stories that help us know what's going on in our communities. And I was thinking, if it's not too presumptuous of me, to ask you to start off by talking about how this book came to be and what the impetus was for you behind writing it.
Sure, I'll be glad to talk to that. Thank you so much for asking that question. I guess for me, the first thing that I'd really want to say about Unstitched is that it's not a book I originally intended to write. My first book, for those of you who have read it, it's a novel. I was always originally drawn to fiction. And it's a book about farming in Vermont and about marriage, although it's also about very difficult things as well. But the way this book came about, a few years ago, I was working as a librarian in a rural Vermont library, in a one-room library. And I was recently divorced. I was a single mother, as I still am, and I began to realize that someone was breaking in after hours. And it took me a little while to figure out what was happening. I was very much caught up in my own life. And what I began to realize was first the scent of cigarette smoke in the morning. Since it's a small town, very quickly rumors began to circulate. And although I do talk about this in the book, for tonight, the two important things to know are it was rumored he was using heroin. And I didn't really want anything to do with him. I wanted just to continue to go on with my own life. And he ended up dying in a very tragic and unfortunate way that I discuss in the book. And that really made me think long and hard about what my role had been with him, although I didn't really know him, and the stigma that I brought to him because he was an opioid user. And it really filled me with shame because I realized whether I wanted to acknowledge this or not, I was a piece of his story. And so Unstitched comes out of the questions that I began asking of my community around me, but also of myself too. Really, really hard questions that to me seemed like was the right time to begin asking those questions. So I could begin by reading just a small piece at the beginning of the end of the first chapter. And I guess for me, it's important to say that the book isn't really explicitly about this person, but it's really about the questions that I began asking afterwards and how this circumstance that I found myself in forced me to begin to look at the world in a different way. And once I began asking questions, how I began interacting with other people in ways that I hadn't anticipated before.
Yeah.
So this first part that I'll read, it's somewhat short. It's at the end of the first chapter. And I'm in the library that night after he died. And he's referred to, this is a book, it's important for me to say it's a book of narrative nonfiction. So I've changed a number of names. There are a number of interviews in the book, and all of the interviews I did have original names. But because I am writing about other people who may not want to be identified, I did change a number of names. So I'll begin here. This is at night in the library. Without turning on the lights, I stood in the dark, quiet library, studying the table where this man, Baker, had been sitting when my trustee walked in. On its back corner sat a white china teacup, factory painted with a faded pink rose, a thorny vine, and 2 unopened buds. The cup was part of a set of 5 that were usually stored upside down beneath the microwave in the adjacent art room. The children who used the library used these cups to hold beads and sequins. Pieces of a now broken apart set, these cups held a hidden history, a reminder that this library and this town had countless stories I didn't know and I never would. I walked over to the table, lifted the cup half full of water, and turned it around and around in my hands. The last time I had seen John Baker was a sunny October afternoon. I was walking from the post office to the library, my arms wrapped around packaged books and envelopes, taking my time in the autumn warmth and admiring the sugar maples glowing scarlet and gold. Baker, wearing a plaid shirt and work boots in need of a shave, sat on the front granite steps of the Episcopal Church. The church holds sporadic services for a handful of elderly parishioners during the summer months and closes in the winter to save on heating costs. I lingered across the dirt road, watching Baker poke at his phone. A single crow flew overhead. We were the only people in our tiny village square that afternoon. Within months, he would be dead. What if, instead of passing him in silence, I had ignored all the gossip and sat down beside him on that sun-warm granite step? But I didn't. I walked up the dusty road and carried on with my life. At the end of that day after Baker's death, I took the cup home with me and set it on my desk. Inside the cup, I noticed scratches from rough washing and a residue of something I couldn't determine. I seemed to have been emptied out too, and what remained were traces of things I couldn't recognize.
You know, listening to you read that passage, I'm struck by and remember from reading it the first time how the images you create, the spaces that you create with your prose, the stone steps, the crow overhead, the isolation of the two of you in this otherwise really, normally bustling town is a really powerful image to me. Just I can see that scene, and the teacup is an image also that I've been unable to shake. It just feels like this link to something, and I wanted to ask you about, no, not ask you, just sort of comment on how that scene is so heartbreaking, the moment where you choose to walk by somebody. And I think that moment fuels a lot of the book, right? Like, as you say, the questions and the things that became important to you to investigate. And it just makes me think about so I come to writing poems too about my brother who was an opioid addict, and how it just reminds me of how easy it is to not want to deal with the issue, right? Even in a family, it's easy to want to pretend it's not there, to pretend it's not happening, to pretend that this is not the story that we want to tell. And I really admire how you tell the story, even though you don't have to. Like, I felt like I had to because it's my family, it's my story, but you didn't have to tell the story, and yet you did. And so I just think that's really beautiful, one. And I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about the steps you took to bring the story to light in the book, like the interviews and things like that.
Yeah. Thank you for saying what you just said. It is interesting how people end up writing certain things and why they end up writing certain things. And I would actually say that I really felt, in a way I've never felt about anything else, really compelled to write this story. And part of it was because I realized if I had been a different woman, I might have made different choices that maybe or maybe not would have had different results. I'll never know. And I don't have that privilege of ever knowing that, because that's gone. But part of it was also, so I could look at the facts of it and see these are the facts of the story and this is what happened. But the deeper and underlying story that appears all through this book is my story as well too. And so I consciously chose to try to pretend I wasn't part of that story, when in fact I was in the story from the very beginning. And it was really easy for me to disparage this person because I could hide behind my librarian persona, when really the person I was disparaging was myself, because I didn't want to look at my own struggles with addiction. And so I hid behind that. And in your life, sometimes you hit these moments where you just have this sort of incredible clarity. And that night I knew that I had done something I really shouldn't have done, that I had taken the easy way out. And I was determined on some level to try to write that, or to try to do it in a different way, not write in the sense of write it out, but RIGHT, to try to change that course. So, but again, these are very complicated things, and I wasn't really sure what to do. So the biggest thing I realized is I needed to understand more about opioid addiction, because I was terribly afraid of it. I was just horrifically afraid of it on all kinds of levels. And so I started reaching out to the usual people in the medical field, law enforcement, but I also reached out to people in recovery. And those stories to me were just life-changing for me, because the people who spoke to me and had the courage to do it were really reflective about their own lives, and also about how those things had happened to them and what role they played in them. So there's this mixture of circumstance, and then there's this mixture of how do we choose our life? And that's something that's always fascinated me, because it is such a puzzle.
That just reminds me to mention something. You mentioned that it's such a puzzle. One of the things I admire about the book too is the way you braid all the stories together. You know, how it's not, if I remember the chapter breakdowns or the breakdowns of the book correctly, it's not here's this thing, here's that thing, here's this thing. There's just sort of revisiting that happens and threads that recur throughout the book, and how often I felt surprised and delighted at the times when these threads came back up. So I think that's a really beautiful part of the book, the sort of lyric weaving you do of all the different threads.
Thank you.
Book. So yeah, it's like surprise too, right? Like you have this constant element, even though like, oh, wait, I just figured out how I want to say this. It's like, instead of feeling like you're moving towards something that's inexorable in a piece of writing, you're just constantly being surprised. You know what I mean? So that it's developing in a way that feels organic instead of rhetorical or prescribed, you know?
Yes,
so.
I do actually. And actually that's also how I look at the world, or how I approach this particular book, because a big piece of this book is for me lifting that veil of stigma. And once I began to lift it very, very slowly, I began to say, what's underneath this? If I cease to look at addiction through this sort of standard societal view, what will I find instead? And that to me was like constantly surprising, but it made me go deeper and deeper and deeper into that. And the other part that I think is important is I could have written a book that was just like a series of like data and statistics, much more sort of like more a clinical view. But for me, it felt really important that this came out of this little town, that I am this woman in this little town, and for me to try to understand the world through this little town I live in, because I think that's like a lens to look at the world as a whole. If you look at yourself intently through where you are, maybe you'll understand yourself in a deeper way as well too. So that setting isn't gratuitous by any means. It's just as integral as everything else in the book. And if you like, I could read just a section here. Here's another little piece I thought of reading. I write about two small towns in particular in Vermont, Woodbury and Hardwick, where I live now. They're side by side, and they're similar towns, but they're also, as anyone who lives in Vermont, you know that they're also different towns too. So I thought of maybe reading just a short piece here that describes, it's at the beginning of the second chapter, and it describes the town Hardwick that I live in. So the way the book is outlined, there's body, mind, and heart. There's 3 sections. And this is the part that's in the section body, which maybe gives you a sense of the physical part of the book that I'm in. Cupped in a wooded valley along the Lamoille River, Hardwick lies at the western edge of Vermont's Northeast Kingdom, so named in a 1949 speech by Senator George Aiken for the 3 northeastern counties' pristine beauty. The fathomless lakes and abundant forest in this corner of the state harbor a population struggling to make do, mixed with mailbox farmers, and those who receive a livelihood via trust fund checks and often drive battered Subarus. According to the most recent census, Hardwick population numbers approximately 1,300 in the village. The whole township claims less than 3,000 residents. In the first half of the 20th century, when Vermont claimed less than 100 miles of paved roads, dairy farming reigned. Family farmers delivered raw milk in 10-gallon stainless steel cans to local creameries, where folks chewed the fat with neighbors while their cans were emptied. Beginning in the 1950s, the state mandated that bulk holding tanks replace those milk cans. Trucks collected milk at the barns, often bypassing the most remote homesteads. The steepest hillside farms yielded too little milk to merit a rugged trip, especially in winter. As small farms folded, forests gradually reclaimed fields across the landscape. Hardwick's history was also shaped by stone. Just beyond the village center, Atkins Field, a rectangular green with an impressive post and beam gazebo and a row of spindly maple saplings, marks the site of the once bustling granite hub. The dandelion-strewn grass skims over an infertile rubble, the debris of granite cutting sheds worked hard and dirty for decades, until the industry slumped in World War I. Today, a single sway-roofed, windowless cutting shed remains, dominating one side of the green. Nearly everything else from that era, save a handful of foundations that peek through the flourishing burdock and raspberry brambles, and the chunks of granite scattered through the nearby woods, has been burned or carted away. Behind the listing shed lies a dirt mountain bike track for kids in the town's community garden, replete with raised boxes, a greenhouse, blueberry bushes, and apple saplings. Through the goldenrod, a footpath meanders to the railroad bed, shadowed by forested Buffalo Mountain. In the years when the railroad ran in the mountain's shadow, steam-powered engines strewed cinders. During World War II, the tracks were torn up, sold for scrap metal, and converted to the war effort. The rail bed is now a trail winding through swamp and scrubby conifer, the pass vanishing beneath vigorous saplings, vines, and wildflowers. Between the field and the mountain, a sturdy wooden bridge constructed for snowmobiles crosses Cooper Brook. In spring or after storms, the spring floods and roars, and the pungent scents of wet soil and broken leaves mingle. Routes 14 and 15 curve through the village along the banks of the Lamoille River, briefly overlapping before 14 jags north to Craftsbury, while 15 and the river head west towards Lake Champlain. The Lamoille nourishes dairy, vegetable, and hemp farming, and carries away the town's cleaned up wastewater too. In the summer, kayakers and anglers explore the water, while tourists snap photos of the famous wooden fissure-covered railroad bridge, the last of its kind used for trains in the state. 50 miles away, at prodigious Lake Champlain, the conjoined waters flow to the Richelieu River, then north to the Atlantic Ocean. So much water, so many rivers, streams, and backyard trickles, so much ice.
Thanks for reading that.
Sure.
It makes me think about, you pull the history of the place from like geologic time into the moment and the history of farming and how the place feels now. And it reminds me too to think about the future, right? So you have the story about this young man and his death and how you feel about it and what you think about it in the interviews you do with people to understand the situation. What do you think, what is my question? There's still this element of hope in the book. It's a really hard story, but I feel like there's some hope. And I wondered to you, what did you find as the most hopeful thing? And I'm blindsiding you with this question, but like there's things in your book that are really about hope for the future. And I wondered if you could say what you think about that.
Sure, I'll be happy to. So in the book, I talk obviously about things that are really, really difficult and people whose lives end up in situations that nobody would really willingly choose. And I write a fair amount about what that is like. I write about crime and what it's like to be a victim of crime. All these elements are real parts of substance abuse. But I also write about the possibility of hope as well too. So one of the interviews that I did was with a woman, and at the end of it, I asked her, if you had one thing to tell someone, what would you say? And this woman had a very different life than I did. She had a life that she struggled with all kinds of things. But I found her incredibly brave, and she was determined to tell her story. And when she thought about it, all she had is just 3 words to say at the end, and that was, recovery is possible. And that doesn't mean it's a guarantee. It doesn't mean that she was at all like misjudging or understating her own prodigious struggles to get sober and to stay sober, but it means that there is that possibility of change. And so when I looked at her, she, for me, was just amazing what she had done in her life. But then when I looked further out beyond individuals, because I think it's important to look beyond individuals, there's also hope for a whole bunch of other people and a whole bunch of our society as well too, despite the really terrible things, that there is hope still. Yeah. And that doesn't belittle the terrible things that do happen by any means, but it lends that to hope and to change. And that's where the title of the book comes out of. And that's from a couple who lost their daughter to an overdose. And the young woman's father said to me, it's as though our society has become unstitched. We've become unraveled on some level, and we have to stitch it back together. And he's in a terribly unenviable position as a father. He's lost his daughter, and yet he still felt this impetus out of love for his daughter in many ways to try to put what their experience to stitching their world back together. Yeah. I guess the other thing too that I want to say about the interviews, because the interviews take up there's 2 themes that braid through the book. There's interviews that I do with other people, and then there's my own journey that I take as well too, where I look at my own struggles. The interviews, I look at them as 2 different pieces, and one is with people who in some professional context are involved in substance abuse recovery. Either they're medical practitioners or they're in prevention. But people whose lives, either they're in recovery or they lost someone to addiction, had very different stories. They were a different side of it, but these were people who hadn't willingly ever chosen that particular kind of life. And so their insight for me and their ability to share those stories was for me particularly valuable. Yeah.
Yeah. I also am reminded when you mention your title of the reference to Unstitched reminds me of your knitting, which is a powerful ballast in the book, the pattern of making a sweater and being willing to go back and unstitch it and rebuild where the mistakes have been made. There's this just incredibly, I didn't want to end talking about your book without mentioning that really powerful metaphor that allows you to think about the issues in the book without even thinking about them. It's like this unconscious thinking that the reader gets to do along with you, like, oh, we can do something really hard, like knit a sweater that's very complicated over a long period of time, but then we can make mistakes and be like, okay, I'm going to take that out and then I'm going to do it again. Like that meditative act of revising our experience is powerful.
And it's like writing that way too. I mean, I love knitting. I am a knitter, and it does go on.
I know you light up when I mention it. You like big smile on your face.
I do, because I mean, knitting for me is just pure joy, because you have that luxury of ripping it apart and beginning again, right?
No, that just puts fear in my heart.
Because there's nothing to lose. Whereas in your life, we never get to repeat the past, right? We can only redo it. And I feel like writing is much harder. It's so much harder than knitting for me, right? on so many different levels. But while we don't get to repeat the past, often in life we get more opportunities to do things differently. And that's one of the reasons that there is hope, right? Because you can change your life. You don't have to change everything, but say you change a little bit here, a little bit there. Just sometimes those little bit of things can make a big difference in a life, and it's less overwhelming. Like, no one could possibly look at opioid abuse and think, I'm going to solve this problem. There's no way. It's just overwhelming. Or even addiction, any of these societal problems. But you could do little bits here and there that may change your life. And maybe, like the people who gave me their stories and shared their stories with me, they changed my life. And then I wove those stories into a book, and I'm hoping their stories will then go out and maybe make a little change in someone else's life too. So
Yeah.
writing is kind of like a big knitting project for me that way.
And you know, your vulnerability as the speaker in the book is also a model for other people, that we can question ourselves. We can think one thing and then be willing to think another. You know, like you mentioned, not wanting to parts of you that didn't want to write this book, right? The things that the story you didn't want to tell, but then you tell it, and then you find things out about yourself, you investigate yourself, you think about the world differently. I just think that that's a really powerful model for all of us, especially with addiction, which is so stigmatized. You know, I think this is the reason that I wrote my book, even though I didn't want to, right? Like this theme of not wanting to do it. I felt like I was lying if I wasn't, as a writer, which is, this is my skill, right? This is the thing I can do. If I don't share the story, then I keep it stigmatized because it's a shameful thing, like losing a family member to addiction. People feel ashamed of it. Right. And if we just keep the lid on it, then we are not sharing, not in community with others, and pretending it's not happening. Right. Just a host of complications. Right. So, yeah.
Right. And that's one of the things. I mean, I love so many things about your poetry. It's beautiful, for one thing. But one of the other things is that you write about things that sink right down, that are some of the hardest things to write about, but you also write about it in a way that's concrete in the world, that's not ethereal, that's not out of the world. It's very connected to who we are as people. Yeah. Which maybe lends, yeah. And I think that's one of the really lovely things about being a writer, or even being a reader, is then you're able to participate on a different level of knowing the world as well too. Yeah. So maybe that lends our discussion to like a nice avenue for you to read some of your poetry, because I'd love to hear some of your poems.
Okay, thanks. That's a good segue. And you mentioned, so this is my book, American Week. And just before I read a few poems, I'll mention that it has kind of three threads to it. So my obsession is about home. And, you know, we were talking earlier about divorce and marriage and things like that. How do we go forward when a home has been broken in any way? And for me, that takes the shape of being a divorced and a single mom for a while. And also, I'm an Irish citizen, but for decades of most of my life, I didn't know where my family was in Ireland. And so a lot of this book is about going back to Ireland and finding my family and reclaiming that home, whatever piece of it I could. A lot of it is in ruins, but then the people are not, the people are there. And then also writing about my brother. So the three threads weave together, which is kind of a great reason why we're talking about our books together, Brett, because we both have this like weaving of different threads through what we write. But I'll just read some poems about my brother. This first poem is called Portrait of the Family as a Definition of the word soon. From Old English sona, immediately, at once, also Frisian, Saxon, Proto-Indo-European, archaic, right now, has come to indicate the near future, has come to indicate promise as it will happen. One, within a short period, at a time that is not long from now, as Soon, said the magic 8-ball. The church bells ringing meant that another of his friends would be buried soon. Soon we will all sit down to dinner. Soon after the last time they gave him the money, he came clean. Who knew how soon we would grow old? B, in a quick way, quickly, as how soon can you help us? After you watch the boy through one-way mirrors, how soon will you understand? After dinner, we play with the Ouija board, but my brother is high and nods off soon before we spell anything. How soon can you give him more money? I wish you'd told me sooner. It was too soon to know. C, in a short time after something happens, as the window has been broken and soon the thief steps in. When the brother is desperate, he says he needs food. And so as soon as they can, the family gives him money. When the needle is inserted, soon the body tingles like sleep and the brother nods off. How did it get so late so soon? 2, used to indicate one's preference in a particular matter, as the mother and father would sooner do anything than forget. They would all sooner wait for a knock on the door than answer the phone. I'd just as soon forget. Synonyms, any minute now, before long, in a little while, presently. Antonyms, after, afterward, later, never. I'll read that one. Sorry, I'm skipping a couple of things.
That's fine.
And this is a poem about the day that I learned that my brother had died. It's called Planetarium. I roamed the antique shops in town to outfit our new house, bringing home 2 flying saucer lamps, a silver bracelet with a blank field for a name, and a vintage Nova Home planetarium to surprise you, thinking you would be someone who had one as a boy, and set it on the dresser in our bedroom, giddy to show you. I unpack a few boxes, poking around the house like an adventurer who doesn't believe in booby traps. My mother calls to say my brother has overdosed and is gone. Her voice is a long and terrible song that grows a crack in my chest, or my bones double. Our home becomes a replica of a home twice as big as a place I can call home, then collapses flat. I make some necessary phone calls. Friends come to sit with me in pajamas and listen. That night in bed, I stare at the ceiling and tell you every story. I walk you back with me. I expand too. I want to know where he is, really, where. I have asked so many times now, where is gone? You get up as if to go to the bathroom or some other mundane, dark of night, glass of water chore. And I think, no, not now. But you turn on the planetarium and light up the sky so I can see where he is.
You know, I have to say, I love this poem. And it's interesting that you read this poem because I woke up thinking about this poem this morning, actually. I just
Wow.
love this poem. And I love this image of a house and of trouble in a house, but also of the light coming overhead. And it's one of the things I really love about your poetry. Yeah, it's a stunning poem.
I thank you. It's funny to me to have written a poem that's both a love poem and a poem of loss, a grieving poem that's also about, love that we can surround ourselves with. And I think that, for me, that's the healing in these stories is what can we surround ourselves with? What do we weave around ourselves so that we can keep going, and hold on to the stories, but also hold on to a sense of life as possible. I don't know if that's too vague, but.
No, I actually think that this is really at the crux of the whole matter. Otherwise, I think you'll just be eaten up by darkness. And the truth is we live in a really dark world, but that's not the only part of the world that we live in. Yeah. And it's interesting because the original title for my book that I used for a while was A Good and Hard Place, because I was writing about all these really, really hard things, and including where I live. These are hard things, but yet also there's so much goodness too. And it took me a while to really realize it's not superficial to embrace the very best things. So
Yeah.
yeah. So please read another poem.
What's that?
Please read another poem.
Yeah. I think what if I just read one more and then we take questions?
Okay. That
Yeah.
sounds good.
There's the other one I wanted to read, but I won't, and I'll just leave it as a teaser. I wrote a book. I wrote a book. I wrote a book. I wrote a poem from words from Nixon's alternative speech in case of a failed moon landing from 1969. And I really liked the project of using someone else's language to write about something difficult, to have a restricted vocabulary that I had to use to write a poem. So that was a wonderful project. I really enjoyed that. That's my teaser. But I'll finish with this poem, and I'll just tell a quick story about, like, you were talking about hope and like how do we move through these things. I was sitting with a student of mine during a study hall, and it was just the two of us, and he had been in my TA for 4 years. We were pretty close, and we were shopping on Craigslist for like weird things, like nothing, just like we were shopping for concepts on Craigslist to see what would show up, like, and so when I say I search Craigslist for sadness, this is true. This is like actually what happened. I just think, like, you're not supposed to say whether a poem is true or not, but I love that the strange beginning of this poem was actually just a real situation. So this is called, I shift my emotions, Weeks After My Brother Overdoses. I search Craigslist for sadness, a white couch, the only result. Happiness lands red shipping containers, and that's it. I wander through days like an envelope marked, please forward. Listen, my brother is a ghost. I keep thinking I am not a sister anymore, though others assure me I still am. Just sister them, builders say, to make a thicker beam or to span a distance. Join the faces of 2x6s with nails, make more from less, make do. No one will let me have my sadness or tally what I've lost. I make lists like recipes for how to go on alone. I draw his death when I doodle, making little crime scenes, as if this epidemic were a murderer, a suspect, a criminal. I draw him on every sidewalk to inflate the numbers, to give my brother to everyone. Inside the outline, I do some math. I add him to 72,000 and subtract him from me. So the year that he died was the year that 72,000 people died of opioid overdose in this country. So, yeah.
That's a very powerful poem.
Thank you.
For reading that. Yeah.
Hi, Andrew.
Thank you, Kerrin. Thank you for those flooring words. I thank you. I'm grateful to both of you. Thank you, Brett, for reading as well, and to everyone out there listening. And if you have questions, now is the time. You can drop them into the chat, or we have a Q&A box down at the bottom of the screen, and we'd love to answer as many questions as we can this evening. Brett, you mentioned that hope is something that has come through this evening a lot for you, and I wonder if you could. I think a lot of people are looking for hope right now. Yep. Where do you find hope in your day-to-day and in your work with the community?
That's a really interesting. That's a really good question, especially for these days here. I think there's many ways to find hope if you're looking for it. I mean, there's plenty of things to feel an absolute despair about these days. We live in complicated times right now, but in complicated times, the world fractures and the world changes. And for me, the the strongest way for me to look at the world, or the most hopeful way for me, is to step back for a moment and look more at where we are in terms of a whole. And when I look at our society now, I see that we have all kinds of challenges, and addiction is one real problem in a series of a world that's just broken apart. But people put things back together again, and we live in a universe that is often very generous at times. We live in a place that's incredibly beautiful. And I also have faith that people will put things back together, that the impetus is for the good. And people make mistakes all the time, including myself. This appears in the book over and over and over. Mistakes are made, people misunderstand each other. We choose decisions and we make decisions that are bad for us. But we can also reflect on that and change the course of our life. And that's where I see hope. And I see it particularly with the youth who are stunningly bright and filled full of all kinds of optimism. But I also see it in just the basic generosity of people too. And for me, the most powerful example was when I asked people for help to understand addiction and asked them to share their stories. I was always given what I asked for. People shared their stories with me, not for any profit of their own, but because they wanted to help other people. And that to me was a stunning example of generosity, where people pay things forward. And I'd rather focus on that and see that that's real evidence of hope and of goodness in people. Kerrin, I'd be curious to know what your answer to that would be.
Yeah, thank you. Where do I find hope? I myself went through a journey of understanding that and too late, I'll confess, that addiction is an illness, and sometimes people survive it and sometimes they don't, right? It's an illness, not a behavior. And I think it's really easy for society to think of people living with addiction as having behaviors. And I think it's important to realize that behaviors are often driven by illness in this situation. And I'm no expert on addiction, but this is something I've come to. And I think I have hope that we can start to see people who are living with addiction as whole and part of society, not hidden and living shameful lives. I think that that's where part of my hope is that we can humanize people who are living with this, just like we are working to humanize people with mental illness, right? We're looking to accept and accommodate and understand. And I think that that's the place where I find hope, is that we might see that. And my daughter came home recently. She's an adult living here with us, and she was in downtown Burlington. And this was her uncle who died, my brother, of course. And she witnessed a parade of people who were celebrating how long they'd been sober from addiction. And they were marching down Church Street and claiming how long, even if it was 2 weeks, how long they had been sober. And people were applauding them, and they were in public marching in community with other people. And that's what I think is hopeful, is when people who are living with addiction can be embraced by society. Yeah.
In the Q&A, somebody mentioned the statistics of deaths of despair, which tie into the opioid crisis a lot, and also into various other crises that we're seeing throughout society. And I wanted to know if you were aware of that data, and also is that something that you've seen in your talks with people, in your interviews, that that people were having trouble finding that hope? Does that ring true to you?
Let me just read this question here. I am really aware of this. I mean, besides being who I am, I'm very aware of the deaths of despair, and I am quite aware that addiction is not inseparable from the world that we live in by any means. I write a lot about this. And this is very much connected to what Kerrin was talking about in terms of disease. So one of the first things that I really began to be aware of when I really started to ask questions about substance abuse is that I was looking at it, people who suffer from substance abuse. Is it a disease or is it bad behavior? And I began to realize that my question, in fact, I wasn't even aware of what I really should be asking, that my vision was so narrow. We tend to think of diseases like something that's just something maybe clinical, right? But the truth is, disease is far more complicated. And addiction is something that, when I look at myself, I can see that genetically my body is driven towards addiction, but I can also see that so many other societal factors also drove me that way as well too, that I'm not, none of us are separable from the society we live in. And to think that we are is also blind as well too. Yeah. I think this is it goes to the heart of really what addiction is about in our society, and why the problems we have with addiction are rising and not sinking. Yeah.
And adding to the statistics of deaths of despair, this morning on VPR and NPR, I heard that murder in 2020 was up by an astronomical number. It was something absurd, like 30%. That's got to be wrong, but it was an absurd number. And people, the commentators were just, saying this is incredibly significant. And I don't know that that's deaths of despair, but it seems like it is,
Yes. I mean, I would, and again, this isn't certainly any observation that's unique to myself, but our whole society is simply out of kilter right now on so many levels, and for reasons that are very complicated, I'm sure. But certainly it's true that regard for each other, we don't live in an empathetic society. And if we could just start to make a move in that way, we would be better off. And that really means not looking at someone through a lens of who they are or who they might present themselves, but really who they are as a person and the whole long story behind them. And that for me was one of the biggest things that I learned from writing this book. Is I began to look at people who just seem like ordinary people, who are not seen as remarkable people, who to me live lives that were just incredibly courageous and productive lives that just floored me in so many ways. And if we allowed ourselves to be less afraid of opening up that way, we would all live richer lives, I think. Yeah.
As someone who works with the community and has worked with your community, what do you think, if anything, and I hope there's something, what do you think is the role of a community, whether large or small, in helping people who are struggling with addiction?
Can I start?
Yes, please.
I never stop being heartened by the story of the family who bought the building and turned it into a community center. And I would love, I just want to point you, Brett, to telling that story, because to me, that model of people who are living with addiction in community with the entire community is incredibly powerful, rubbing shoulders with all kinds of people, not just stuck in clinics and housing facilities, like in the cities. So.
Okay, it's a great, so there's two images. The book begins in that little piece that I read. It begins with an empty church in the little town of Woodbury that's essentially emptied out. It's essentially abandoned, and it's a beautiful building. The second image, and so the book begins that way. The second image of the church appears, and they're both actual churches, is in the very end of the book, where I interview a couple who have spoken very publicly about their daughter. Their names are Don and Greg Tatro. They live in Johnson, and their daughter died of an overdose. And they ended up buying a church that was empty in Johnson that had a lot of meaning for their family. They had been married there, but the church had been empty. And in the book, I go and interview them in the church. They used Jenna's life insurance policy to buy the church. And they had this vision that they would turn it into a community center, that it would be a place of recovery for people who are recovering from substance abuse, but that it would be open to the entire community and the entire community would be welcome. And when I initially interviewed them, the church was cold. They had just bought it. It was dusty, but they were just beginning that process. And now they have, mostly through donations, to be honest, through just incredible gifts from all across the community, have opened up this phenomenal recovery center and a community center. And their idea has always been from the very beginning, after they went through their own incredibly painful journey, is there's no us or them in addiction. It just doesn't work that way. Some people struggle with certain things, other people struggle with other things. But if we're going to be a whole and healthy community, we have to welcome everybody. And part of that is the Tatros understand it's almost impossible to get sober on your own. The odds are so against anyone to try to get sober on their own. The drugs are simply so strong and so powerful. It's almost impossible to do on your own. But as a whole, we can offer hope for individuals and for a community as a whole. It's just the most beautiful possible vision that in fact they have actually put into practice. And I think it's even more powerful that it came out of this couple. It didn't come out of a particular program. It didn't come out of a state program. It came out of this one family. And I wish them so much luck. Yeah.
Thank you. Great comment in the chat from Wendy about the peer recovery movement. Wendy's working in peer recovery in Western Massachusetts. So
Yeah.
thank you. Sounds like
one of the things I just wanted to mention, sort of along the lines of peer recovery and being in community, is the opposite of that, where in my brother's situation, he ended up homeless and couldn't find a shelter because he had to be close enough to the clinic where he got his treatment for recovery. But he couldn't find housing close enough to the clinic, and to live across the city in the place where there was housing and shelters for people who need them, he couldn't afford the transportation across the city to get to the clinic every day. Right? So there was this total like built-in isolation system where it just wasn't going to work. There was no housing near the clinic. And just the fact of like someone like that trying to find community or trying to build a life where the odds are stacked against being close with other people or being in community, just seemed unjust to me. I remember trying to work on it and trying to figure out, and there was no way to stitch him, just to use that phrase, that word, to a community, because all the resources were so scattered. So this is, I think, what Wendy mentions and what you're talking about is really beautiful.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned isolation too, Kerrin, because thinking about that's so connected to the deaths of despair. I mean, if there's one thing that we have all learned from the pandemic, is that people are not meant to be isolated, and that isolation is just toxic. Yeah. And that we need each other.
Yep.
Wendy, if you want to contact me, Sam, actually, if you don't mind, could you mind just dropping my email address into the chat box there, if you don't mind? I'm happy to have anyone who wants to reach out to me. I'd be happy to hear from you. My email address is very simple. It's just my name, brettstanciu@gmail.com. But I'd be happy to have anyone contact me. I'd welcome your thoughts and your experiences. I'd be very interested to hear. Thank you.
And my email is the same. It's my first name dot my last name @gmail.com.
Sometimes I'm fast to copy paste. Well, thank you so much to both of you. We are coming to the end of our time here, but did want to ask before we go, what are each of you working on next? What's on the horizon?
Kerrin, do you want to go first?
I mean, sure. I am theoretically trying to write a book that is more experimental and more whimsical. And this book is pretty heavy for me in lots of levels. And so I'm looking to investigate my imagination more and really enjoy that space and playing with language. So that's the goal, but then who knows what'll happen in life to actually, tie me to something else. But right now I'm working on a new job. I have a new teaching job. So that's sort of all I'm doing, is figuring that out.
Okay.
How about you, Brett?
What I would like to write about next, I'm writing some essays right now, but what I'm mostly interested in writing about next is particularly women in recovery and the unique challenges that women face, and particularly rural women in our state. That's something I'm very, very interested in. In Unstitched, I write a lot about parenting and what it's like to be a mother. These are essential parts of our life, and that's the next direction I believe I'll be heading into. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm just going to make sure that everyone can see the email address you so generously shared. Brett, it looks like somebody is having
It's like
trouble
someone's
seeing
looking
that.
in the Q&A for the email address, not in the chat.
I'll make sure that it's going to everyone. There it goes again. So it should be there in the chat now. Yeah, sorry, that was me. That was me pressing buttons incorrectly. Blame Sam. Thank you to both of you, and I am very excited to hear what's next from each of you. In the meantime, Unstitched is the new book from Brett Ann Stanciu. It is available now where books are sold, including at the Norwich bookstore, and you can pick up a copy from us. We are happy to ship it to you if you're not local to the area, or if you are here in the area, please do come by the store and pick one up off the shelves. We'd be delighted to see you. And Unstitched is published by Steerforth Press. They're our local press here. They do a lot of really important books, a lot of important works of nonfiction, memoirs, books like Unstitched that are a bit of memoir, a bit of social history, a bit of seeking hope. So they do really incredible work, and we are really grateful to them. They're in Hanover, New Hampshire. Always worth checking out their list as well. On behalf of all of us here at the Norwich Bookstore, I'm so grateful to you, Brett Ann Stanciu, Kerrin McCadden. Thank you both for joining us this evening, and thank you for your work. Thank you for your thoughts. Thank you for listening and working and doing what you do. And all of you out there, thank you for tuning in. Be safe, do good work, and we'll see you next time. We're all in this together. Thanks so much. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much.